Hi guys, welcome to Fierce and Pretty. Honey here. I was doing a Christmas cleaning in the house today and I decided to also clean my tarot attic and organize my cards. So I thought that while I was anyway dragging all the decks out of the shelves, I would film a video about how my collection looks at the end of 2020. And as I have said in several videos already, I'm actually quite pleased to my collection as it is now, and I have no intentions of getting any more decks anytime soon. So I thought I would show these in groups. And the first group here are my study decks. The Tarocchi Visconti di Modrone, and it's not a complete deck, it's only got 67 cards left, but a historical Italian deck, and this is an Il Meneghello deck. I think having these old decks to study while reading the books is interesting to have them, even though I don't use them. But when it comes to my study decks, the most essential, I think, is the Visconti Sforza deck. The first full deck that we have left. And this is also an Il Meneghello version. We have other versions of this deck available, but I would never really use this deck for readings. I think reading with these historical decks isn't very easy, or they don't speak so naturally to me. But I think having them is a great add-on for studies. And then this is the Solabusca, the weirdest tarot deck that I have. This is the Lo Scarabeo version, and reading with this for me would be impossible. But again, for study purposes, it's a deck that is staying in my collection. Then we have the Tarocco Neoclassico Italiano. It's a vintage deck from the 80s, which again is purely a study deck to me. But when it comes to reading, this would be one of my study decks that I would firstly choose for readings. I think it's really clear and really easy. Then one study deck that I don't use also in readings is the Etela. But I think it's referred in so many literature when it comes to the historical tarot decks that it's a fun add-on to the study collection, even though it has its own weird system. And then also the last deck in the study group is the Golden Dawn Tarot, and this is the US Games version. Again, a deck that I don't like to read with, but I want to have still in my collection only for the study purposes. Even though none of these decks really get to be used in readings, they are still staying in my collection. Then if we jump to another category, the Marseilles Tarot, I only have 3 Marseilles style decks. Actually, only one of them is a pure traditional Marseille. The most traditional Marseille I have is the Grimoire version of Marseille. It's just because I wanted to have one quite standard Marseille deck. But when it comes to readings, I really don't enjoy the color palette in this deck, so it doesn't get a lot of use, but I still want to keep one straight up Marseille in my collection. My absolute favorite Marseille deck is the Le Tarot Noir, and in this deck I especially love the colors, but I also love the art. And even the bigger size doesn't annoy me. I still can handle this deck. And the soft colors make it a perfect deck for me whenever I feel like using a Marseilles tarot. To me, this is just perfect. I don't enjoy the traditional Marseilles so much, so I'm really happy that I found this Le Tarot Noir with this specific art style and the quite different art style that isn't just straight up Marseilles, but it is an absolute favorite. And then the Keymaster Tarot. Why is it in the Marseilles pile? Well, because of the pips, I think. Even though this deck could be in so many categories. We have the majors here, but then the minors. They are like playing card minors, but if you look closer, we have the Marseilles patterns there in the gilding. So this is a mixture of a playing card deck mixed with Marseilles imagery in the minors, and this is a totally unique deck. It was a Kickstarter and it is a modern, really different deck, and I don't think that there's anything like this amongst other tarot decks, and that's what makes it so unique. You can find so many ways to use it, and you can use so many different styles if you just are familiar with cartomancy and transferring to tarot, or however, or vice versa if you're switching more towards cartomancy with playing cards. This is a great gateway. Then we are jumping to the world of Thoth Tarot, and as you can see, I quite like the Thoth deck. These are not even all my Thoth copies. I still have 2 more in the drawer, so I have very many copies of the one deck, but they all are different in some way. For example, I have a Swedish version, then I have vintage versions, I have the remastered versions with the better imagery taken with the new camera, with the different backs, and also with the more softer images that are supposed to be more closer to the paintings, which they took with the fancy new cameras. So I have 2 different versions of this. One is in German, and the one living here is a Finnish version of the same deck. Then I do have newer versions, a lot of vintage versions. Many of them have their own bags where they live. Here, for example, lives the gilded version. I have a whole video going through my Thoth decks. If anybody is interested on any of the specific decks, I can link it here. But also when it comes to, I love great tarot cases, and my favorite decks, of course, have special cases for them. So many of them are Thoth decks. This is my old small white box. It lives with a quartz crystal and so on. But when it comes to Thoth, one would perfectly be okay with just having one deck. And if I could have only one version of the Thoth, it would be the greenie, which is my favorite version of the Thoth decks, even though I have the even more vintage white box there. But for some reason the greenie is just my absolute favorite. But when it comes to collecting tarot cards, I could say that I collect different editions of the Thoth deck, and there I would consider myself a collector. But when it comes to the other tarot, I don't consider myself so much a collector. I just wanted to have different decks in the process of finding out what I like, what is for me, what works, what doesn't. I have sold few decks and given many of them away, but when it comes to Thoth, I'm keeping all these. They all are unique and I use them all in different days, however I feel like. And even though I have very many of them, they all get to come out of their boxes and play every now and then. But while we are talking about my Thoth madness, it doesn't end with just simply the Aleister Crowley's and Lady Frida Harris's Thoth Tarot. I also really love the Emma Maline's Tabula Mundi and the Rosetta Tarot. And then two decks that I also consider to be in my Thoth category are Tarot of Ceremonial Magic by Lon Milo Duquette and the Silic Tarot, even though it is a bit different. My absolute favorite of my Thothy decks is the Tabula Mundi by Emma Maline, and my version is the silverware version. It has beautiful backings. This was the deck in 2020 that I waited the most and the longest to come from US, and I haven't been disappointed. She truly is a genius when it comes to Thoth Tarot, and the way she created this deck and the Liber M book. I loved the deck so much that I also wanted to have this smaller version, a travel version, which is easy. And it has all the beautiful details in the backings, as does the bigger deck. The only difference between these two on top of size is that this has the text in black, the other one is silver. But of course the bigger version is better. And then my third Emma Maline's deck is the Rosetta, but I have the papyrus version, which is, the text is in hieroglyphs. It is highly Egyptian influenced deck, and to be honest, sometimes it is a bit hard before you really know this deck and which card is which, because the numberings are just dots and then a symbol like this is the Four of Air, so Four of Swords, if you're not fluent in hieroglyphs. But still, I also really like the Rosetta, even though the Tabula Mundi is my favorite when it comes to Emma Maline. Then to the Lon Milo Duquette's deck. This ain't the prettiest deck there is. The colors are so bright, so weird, but it is a unique version of the Thoth, but it also includes so much more Enochian magic and angels and whatever. It has so much in it that I will probably never use. So this isn't a deck that I read with. It goes a bit more to my study deck category, but for some reason I just had to get it, and no matter how seldom I use it, it's a deck that is going to stay. And then the Silic Tarot, it is a deck that my daughter chose to me, and that is a reason why also this one is staying, even though I don't use it very often. It's not a straight on Thoth deck, it's kind of a hybrid made with watercolors. It's really soft and really different. The imagery is like nothing else. And this, my version, is a tin. Then when it comes to straight up Rider-Waite-Smith decks, here is my full collection of those. So I only actually have 4 straight up Rider-Waite-Smith decks, and one of them is kind of a duplicate because the Centennial I have in a tin and in the bigger version. The Finnish yellow box Rider-Waite-Smith I bought simply if my daughter wants to learn tarot one day. It would be easier for her to start with a finished deck. This ain't the best quality and I don't use it myself, but it is here in the hope that maybe one day, if my daughter really feels like starting to study the tarot, that would be for her. Then the crown jewel of my Rider-Waite-Smith deck collection, even though it's small, is the vintage blue box with the Blushing Fool. And this is just a special deck. There you see the Fool. But the creamy quality of this deck is amazing. And even though, and this Hermit, the coloring and everything, it's beautiful. Even though I'm more of a Thoth girl, this is still totally a keeper and one of my most precious decks, the Blushing Fool deck. But I do like a lot about the Centennial Edition. I love how sturdy these cards are, and the coloring is also soft, like in the vintage deck. So when it comes to value and money, this is, you know, one of the greatest decks that anybody can buy, the Centennial. And the praises over YouTube are totally deserved, and it is one of the best modern versions of the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. And my Centennial actually was the first deck I got, and that's why it still lives in this really Egyptian case, which would better fit for a Thoth deck, but it was this deck's first home and it gets to keep. And then let's jump to my vintage decks, and these are decks that I liked so much. I first got the vintage versions, like the Aquarian here. Mine is the blue back, and I really love the quality of this deck, and it is really special. But I still wanted to have a modern version of this deck that I could carry with me carefree, because with vintage decks I'm always a bit more careful. So that's why I bought the tinned version, and it has the same backs as the vintage version that I have. And again, I like the US Games quality in these tin decks. They are nice to shuffle, sturdy card stock. So that's why I have a duplicate there. And the same is with the Morgan Greer. I love the vintage version that I have. Again, the quality in vintage decks is something really special. But for the same reasons as with the Aquarian Tarot, I wanted to have a tin version that I can take with me easily and don't have to be so careful with it. And in this vintage version, the difference is in the backs. They are not all the same. The stars are aligned differently. Because as you see in this tin deck, all the backs are same. All the stars are in same places. And when it comes to comparison with other US Games tin versions, this is a bit thinner cardstock. This isn't as sturdy as the Aquarian and the Centennial Rider-Waite-Smith. And then definitely one of my weirdest decks is the James Bond edition of the Tarot of the Witches deck. So this has the 007 backings, but the card's imagery is exactly the same as in the original deck. This is just so weird, and I had to have it. This is a deck for me that forever reminds me about my brothers and my father and the times when we were young, when we were watching James Bond movies together. So this is just a classic that I just had to have. Then it starts to get a bit more tricky how to categorize all these decks. But for some reason, these three decks, the Llewellyn Tarot, Anna Kay, and the Druidcraft, kind of feel really similar to me. All these decks I really like a lot. All of them I've also edged, and they have really unique feeling in each of them. I love the softness in the Llewellyn. This is probably one of my first favorite decks ever. And I like to work together with Llewellyn and the Anna Kay because of the similar card size and some similarities, but so much differences in the art. But I think that working together with these decks works beautifully, and I love them both. And then the Druidcraft. This is really elemental deck. Really, for me, it's so earthy in so many ways. It's a grounding deck to me, and one that I feel like is really comforting. Alright, so my camera battery just died and I thought I would continue with my phone. So let's see. The next category is Robert M. Place decks. And I have the Alchemical Tarot, the renewed 5th edition, and the 1st edition, and the Tarot of the Sevenfold Mystery. Here we have the Alchemical Tarot 1st edition and the renewed 5th edition side by side. I have made a full walkthrough of these decks, but even though they are kind of the same deck, there are differences, and I love them both, and they both feel different. And especially in the 5th edition, I love the sound that these cards have. The quality of the 5th edition is just great. And the shuffling sound is amazing, but I love these both. For some reason, this Alchemical Tarot 5th edition has found its place in my collection, regarded a lot in the readings when the question is around work. So about people's work and working situations, I found this deck to fit those type of questions very well. But the Tarot of the Sevenfold Mystery is still a bit of a mystery to me. It's not so straight up Rider-Waite-Smith based, even though even the Alchemical Tarot is a bit of its own system, but I just haven't found my way with this deck. I know many people love it, but for some reason I haven't been able to connect with it yet, but still I'm keeping it in my collection because I love Robert M. Place's work, and maybe one day we will find a way to communicate. But until that time, it just gets to stay in the collection. As you can see, there will be less decks and less decks coming together, because now it starts to get tricky to categorize these decks and put them in, you know, same drawers. But these two are both by Daniel Noel, the Moon Child, and the Star Child, the Akashic version. The Akashic version of the Star Child was one of the first decks that I got, and initially I thought that I wouldn't be able to work with it because I was a beginner and it was so different from Rider-Waite-Smith. But this deck has been one of the biggest surprises in all of my decks. It's so not me. It's so pretty. It is so pink. It is so purple. But for some reason, the readings I've done with this deck have all been amazing. And from the beginning, we just had a great connection. And for that reason, even though it's so not me, but it is one of my favorite decks. And the Moon Child I got later on because I loved the Star Child so much, and I heard other people's praises of this deck. But for me, the Star Child is a favorite over the Moon Child. But still, I'm keeping this deck, even though it is so thick and that it makes it hard to shuffle sometimes. Then the next trio, these are kind of more cosmic decks. This is the Cosmic Tarot, it is the Finnish version. This is the Wizard's Tarot, but it's the Spanish version. And then we have the Tarot of the Spirit. And the reason I've put these decks together is that even though they don't have similarities, but the Cosmic Tarot here, it's a classic deck, but I like to have a Finnish version of it. It is really old school, and because of its name, the Cosmic Tarot, I think it's in this bunch. The art style is maybe not my favorite, but I still really like to have this classic deck in my collection, and the backing is really cosmic. But the Tarot of the Wizards has a lot of astrology combined to it, and the book that actually inspired me to get this was the Tarot and Astrology book by Corinne Kenner. And the English version of this deck isn't available anymore, so that's why I got the Spanish version that was available. But this deck combines a lot of astrology in it and was a great companion with the book. And then the Tarot of the Spirit. It has it also has astrology in it, but it is my main Kabbalah deck. And this deck actually came with this Tree of Life see-through card that you can put, oh, it's the wrong way around, on top of the cards where you see all the Sephiroth and all the paths that you can put on top of the imagery. I also got the 2 huge books about this deck, and going through them will take its own time. It is a really deep dive into the Kabbalah, but this is one of those decks that I love to work with because it's so elemental, and it's also a perfect tool to dive in deeper to the Kabbalah. I'm at the point in my collection where it's practically impossible to try to link these decks together in any way, so I'm just gonna go through them quickly one by one. And this is the Darkness of the Light Tarot. It's by Tony DiMauro, and I have the edition with the white backs and the white frames. I would love the black edition, which is now currently available, but it wasn't when I was buying this deck. And this deck is really unique in my collection. It's really close to my taste. I love all the bearded men. I love the darkness, even though it would be more darker with the black borders, but I'm okay with the whites. And this is one of my, as I consider, more darker decks, and it has a great place. And I find that the men love it when you're doing readings for males, that this is something that will also please their eyes, like compared to the Star Child or something really pink. So I like to have decks that also are enjoyable for different querents. And the Pagan Otherworlds I only use in my Lunar Moon readings, and I love these little moon cards that come with the deck, and I think they were the reason why I started to use them in my full moon or new moon readings. I edged mine with golden ink pad because I couldn't afford the 22 karat gilded version of this deck, but I love this, and this deck's only purpose is to serve me in my moon readings, and I love it. The only thing that I don't love is this how slippery the cards are. I find that quality a bit tricky while shopping. One of the most special decks in my collection is the finished version of the Mythology Fennica Tarot, which in Finnish is called Ukonpakka. And while I was interviewing Susanna, she was lovely enough to sign my copy. And the Mythology Fennica Tarot, it is its own unique system. If you are interested to know more about, I recommend you watch my interviews that I did in November with Susanna. But this deck is not a straight up Rider-Waite-Smith, nor is it a Thoth. It is its own system based on the Finnish mythology and our national epic poetry called Kalevala. But being a Finn, this is something truly special and unique. And one of the biggest inspiration that this deck has given to me is was the fact that it made me look into my roots, into my heritage, do some study in my family lineage, all those things that I talked about on my last video about my DNA result. And directly linked to that topic of genealogy and looking into my past is the Ancestral Path Tarot, which I was inspired to get when I was watching Saturnarium's video about this deck. This deck is really unique, and I like to use it with the Weaver's Oracle, and not in everyday mundane readings, but to me this deck is a lot deeper. And for example, if looking into past lives or things like that, I think that this deck has its place also in those type of specific and special readings. But I really love this deck, even though it is not an everyday workhorse to me. And while I was talking about my friend Saturnarium, I thought I would choose this deck next. And you know, the funniest thing, the synchronicities, is that I started to film this with my big camera. Then my battery died, and I went to YouTube to see how I could spend my time while waiting the camera battery to reload. And I saw that Saturnarium had just uploaded a video exactly when I'm filming, so her full collection. So I thought that was so funny and synchronistic. But this is the AfroBrazilian Tarot that she so kindly sent to me just a week ago or something. And this is going to be a deck that will require time and patience for me, because it's based on the Candomblé Afro-Brazilian religion that I know nothing about, because I'm a Finn. But I'm finding this deck really interesting, and also it is a special gift sent to me from all the way from Brazil, so it's going to stay in my collection forever. And I truly believe that one day I will find my unique Finnish way of understanding this deck that couldn't be farther away from my background. But in the way that she has learned to work with the Mythology Fennica Tarot, which is a Finnish deck, and she's learned to work with that one in Brazil. So I believe that I'm able to crack the codes for this Afro-Brazilian deck up here in Finland. And while traveling around the world here through tarot cards, let's jump to Italy with the Venetian Tarot by Eugene Vinitsky, and this was the first indie deck that I got, and the colors and everything are so amazing in this deck. The way he uses the light, and my only complaint about this deck is how slippery and shiny it is, but otherwise it is a beautiful, beautiful deck, and I liked it so much that I also got the mini version of this deck. The Deviant Moon Borderless was one of the first decks that I bought to myself, and it was a birthday present for me, from me, and this is one of the darkest decks that I have, more of the shadowy side, and I really enjoy working with this, but it's not an everyday tarot deck to me like the Thoth is. I can use the Thoth with everything, but the Deviant Moon, it is for some deeper, darker questions where I use it more on the shadow side. Then the Tarotilluminati was also one of the first decks that I bought, which is, I think, unique in its way, because each suit depicts people from different heritage and different skin colors, and so I think it's an interesting deck in its way, because all the suits have distinct looking people in them. And actually in the beginning this was the deck that I used the most, even though that's not the case anymore, but it's always going to stay in my collection. It makes me always feel a bit nostalgic. Game of Thrones Tarot is a deck that I bought purely out of my love for the series Game of Thrones, and when it comes to tarot readings I don't use it that much, but it is a piece in my collection that I will always keep because of the fact that I really enjoyed the series so much, and it is a series that I think that I will watch several times. I watched it now 2 times, the full thing, but I don't think that I might get up to 5 or 10 times at least during the lifetime that I'm gonna be watching this series. It was so great. Then the newest deck that came into my collection this week, the Infernal Tarot, and this was the last deck that I had waiting because it was a Kickstarter deck, and it was the last deck that I was supposed to get, and now I feel that my collection is, you know, complete. And of course there are new decks coming, but I think that I'm gonna be a whole lot more mindful in the future about the decks that I'm going to get. And the Infernal Tarot, it is, I love the old style that it has, and because of its black backs, it goes to the same category to me somewhat than the Deviant Moon. It is a bit darker deck, and for specific readings, it's not an everyday workhorse, but it is a deck that I have been shuffling and shuffling and shuffling a lot during these weeks, because in the initial video I said it was tricky to shuffle, but the more I shuffle it, the better it feels in my hands. Now it's only tricky because I have so little space here, but the sound in this deck is amazing, and I've learned to really enjoy the cardstock, even though in the beginning I thought it was really thin, but I'm starting to enjoy the shuffling. The more I do it, the more I enjoy it. The Cosmic Cycles Tarot was actually one of the first decks that I ordered, an indie deck, but it took forever. It took, I don't know, it took over a year to come to me or something around that. But it was a deck that my daughter really wanted for us to buy, so I could do tarot readings for her. And as you can see from the art style, it is really cute and almost childlike. So it's a perfect fit when reading to a teenager. And this shows images that a young person can relate to. So I think that's a strong suit in this deck, that for the younger generation, this shows modern situations where they can understand these card meanings. For example, if you look at the Temperance doing yoga there, getting her balance on, and you know, Three of Swords, the agony and heartache in a young person. or look at the teacher looking, you know, hard as Queen of Swords there. So I think this is a nice deck, even though I don't use it to myself, for my own readings. I think that it serves a specific purpose in my collection for specific querents. And even though I had to wait this deck for a long time, the quality in this deck is superb, and the edges were like this when I got it. So it is a high quality deck, even though really modern, and I think more fit to younger people or the people with younger minds. And we have only 3 decks to go, and these are my favorite decks that are not Thoth decks. And the Fountain Tarot was a gift from the hubby to me, and I got it while we were in London. So it has so much special memories attached to the deck, but even without those memories, I really love this deck. I know that some people feel that it is a colder deck, but to me it was love at first sight, and the way this deck reads is phenomenal. And this is actually going to be one deck that I'm going to be working a lot next year in 2021, because I actually bought the book to go with this deck in the middle of this year, and I wanted to start to use it in the beginning of next year. And here is the book that I mentioned, the Fountain Tarot Journal, a year in 52 readings. And this is a book that I'm going to start to work with in 2021, because I wanted to have a fresh start with New Year. So that means that the Fountain Tarot will be an essential part next year in my daily tarot practice. Then to a deck that surprised me a lot this year is Chris Ann's The Light Sears Tarot. And I have the mass market edition, which I have edged. But when this deck came out, it got so much, you know, visibility in social media, and I thought that why is everybody liking it, and I didn't. And I thought that it was too colorful, it was too pretty, it was too everything. But then at some point I just thought that because it became mass market and it was affordable, I thought I would give it a try. And I didn't expect to like this deck at all, but I ended up getting such great readings with it. So it's a definite keeper and a deck that truly surprised me. And now I understand why so many people love it. And in the process, I've learned to love it too. Then, last but definitely not least, the Shimmering Veil Tarot by Cilla Conway. And this mine is the second edition with the gilding on it. And this deck, when I saw it in YouTube and in Instagram, I first thought, my initial thoughts were a bit like with the light Sears, that it's definitely not for me, and that's the reason I don't have the first edition. It looked so more like those intuitive decks. It just, 'cause it doesn't have any names written on the pictures, and the symbols are elemental symbols for the suits. So I don't know. I thought that it wouldn't be for me, and the art style just, I don't know. But when I got this deck, everything changed, and it was a connection that I had been searching for with tarot decks. And I didn't even read the guidebook. I just started to work with it, and I wasn't expecting to be able to work with such an intuitive deck, even though yes, the images are Rider-Waite-Smith based, but some of them are just so different. They are not so clear. But the way that this deck started to speak to me was just amazing, and the connection was instant. And not only this deck, but the fact that how perfectly it talks also with my reindeer runes. Every single time I do a small reading, like 2 cards from the Shimmering Veil Tarot and 1 rune, or 2 cards, 2 runes, something really small. But those readings are every time so mind-blowing, and the connection between the runes and how they force or strengthen each other's messages, or just what's the perfect word? So hard, but they work seamlessly together. My reindeer runes and this deck, and it is a pair that I have been using almost daily. So for the time being, my absolute favorite decks that I have on my living room table downstairs, where I spent most of the time, are the Shimmering Veil, and then one of my Thoth Tarots. And these are just, even if I could just have 2 decks, I think at this moment it would be the Shimmering Veil and 1 Thoth deck. But I'm happy that I don't have to choose, and I don't have to narrow it all to all that. But here was my collection of, I don't know, roughly 60 decks or something. And when it comes to oracle decks, I only have 3 oracle decks, and I'm not a big oracle person, so I don't think that I will be getting more oracle decks. But also when it comes to tarot, I'm very happy with my collection. I think that more Thoth decks, more versions of vintage Thoth might be coming into my collection, but I think that in 2021 my wallet will be happy, because there will definitely not be so many tarot decks to buy. So this was my tarot collection. If you have any questions or comments, just pop them down below. I always love to hear about you guys. And with this Christmas cleaning episode of my tarot collection, I wish you all happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Hyvää joulua, God jul, and let's hope that next year will bring some more light and love into all of our lives, because I know that this year has been tough to us all, but I also think that many of us have found a lot of comfort in the tarot cards. So until next time, bye guys!